A Retrospect, Chapter 9, Early Missionary Experiences. On landing in Shanghai on the 1st of March, 1854, I found myself surrounded with difficulties that were wholly unexpected. A band of rebels known as the Red Turbans had taken possession of the native city, against which was encamped an imperial army of from 40 to 50,000 men, who were a much greater source of discomfort and danger to the little European community than were the rebels themselves. Upon landing, I was told that to live outside of the settlement was impossible, while within the foreign concession apartments were scarcely obtainable at any price. The dollar, now worth about 3 shillings, had risen to a value of 8 and 9 pence, and the prospect of one with only a small income of English money was dark indeed. However, I had 3 letters of introduction, and counted on counsel and help, especially from one of those to whom I had been commended, whose friends I well knew and highly valued. Of course, I sought him out at once, but only to learn that he had been buried a month or 2 before, having died from fever during the time of my voyage. Saddened by these tidings, I inquired for a missionary, to whom another of my letters of introduction was addressed, but a further disappointment awaited me. He had left for America. The 3rd letter remained, but as it had been given by a comparative stranger, I expected less from it than from the other 2. It proved, however, to be God's channel of help. The Reverend Dr. Medhurst of the London Mission, to whom it was addressed, introduced me to Dr. Lockhart, who kindly allowed me to live with him for 6 months. Dr. Medhurst procured my first Chinese teacher, and he, Dr. Atkins, and the late Mr. Andrew Wiley gave me considerable help with the language. Those were indeed troublous times and times of danger. Coming out of the city one day with Mr. Wiley, he entered into conversation with 2 coolies, who, while we waited a little while at the east gate for companion, who was behind us, before our companion came up, an attack upon the city from the batteries on the opposite side of the river commenced, which caused us to hurry away to a place of less danger, the while the whiz of the balls being unpleasantly near. The coolies, unfortunately, stayed too long and were wounded. On reaching the settlement, we stopped a few minutes to make a purchase, and then proceeded at once to the London Mission compound, where at the door of the hospital we found the 2 poor coolies with whom Mr. Wiley had conversed, their 4 ankles terribly shattered by a cannonball. The poor fellows declined amputation, and both died. We felt how narrow had been our escape. At another time, early in the morning, I had joined one of the missionaries on his veranda to watch the battle proceeding, at a distance of perhaps 3/4 of a mile, when suddenly a spent ball passed between us and buried itself in the veranda wall. Another day, my friend, Mr. Wiley, left a book on the table after luncheon, and returning for it about 5 minutes later, found the arm of the chair on which he had been sitting shot clean away. In the midst of these and many other dangers, God protected us. After 6 months' stay with Dr. Lockhart, I rented a native house outside the settlement and commenced a little missionary work among my Chinese neighbors, which for a few months continued practically. When the French joined the imperialists in attacking the city, the position of my house became so dangerous that during the last few weeks, in consequence of nightly recurring skirmishes, I gave up attempting to sleep, except in the daytime. One night a fire appeared very near, and I climbed up to a little observatory I had arranged on the roof of the house to see whether it was necessary to escape. While there, a ball struck the ridge of the roof on the opposite side of the quadrangle, shattering pieces of broken tile all around me, while the ball itself rolled down into the court below. It weighed 4 or 5 pounds, and had it come a few inches higher, would probably have spent its force on me instead of on the building. My dear mother kept the ball for many years. Shortly after this, I had to abandon the house and return to the foreign settlement, a step that was taken none too soon, for before the last of my belongings were removed, the house was burnt to the ground. On the trials of this early period, it is scarcely possible to convey any adequate idea. To one of a sensitive nature, the horrors, atrocities, and misery connected with war were a terrible ordeal. The embarrassment also of the times was considerable. With an income of only £80 a year, I was compelled, upon moving into the settlement, to give £120 for rent, and sublet half the house, and that the committee of the Chinese Evangelization Society increased my income when, after the arrival of Dr. Parker, they learned more of our circumstances. Many painful experiences had necessarily been passed through. Few can realize how distressing to so young and untried a worker these difficulties seemed, or the intense loneliness of the position of a pioneer who could not even hint at many of his circumstances, as to do so would have been a tacit appeal for help. The great enemy is always ready for his oft-repeated suggestion, "All these things are against me, but oh, how false the word!" The cold and even the hungry, the watchings and sleepless nights of danger, and the feeling at times of utter isolation and helplessness were well and wisely chosen, and tenderly and lovingly meted out. What circumstances could have rendered the Word of God more sweet, the presence of God more real, the help of God more precious? They were times, indeed, of emptying and humbling, but were experiences that made not ashamed, and that strengthened purpose to go forward as God might direct, with His proved promise, "I will not fail thee nor forsake thee." One can see even now that as for God His way is perfect, and yet can rejoice that the missionary path of today is comparatively a smooth and an easy one. Journeying inland was contrary to treaty arrangements, and attended with much difficulty, especially for some time after the Battle of Muddy Flat, in which an Anglo-American contingent of about 300 Marines and seamen, with a volunteer corps of less than 100 residents, attacked the Imperial camp and drove away from 30 to 50,000 Chinese soldiers, the rest of our shot and shell making the native artillery useless. Still, in the autumn of 1854, a journey of perhaps a week's duration was safely accomplished with Dr. Atkins, who, of course, did the speaking and preaching, while I was able to help in the distribution of books.